myself for a moderator of this session, because my understanding of budget is the same as most of the country. So I think we are all up for some learning from the session today. And since we need an overview of the entire thing, I'd request Dr. Abid, Executive Director, to begin with a brief overview of the budget for us all.
Thank you, Aisha. सबसे पहले तो हमें इस चीज को बारे में माइंडफुल होना चाहिए कि हुकूमत इस वक्त एक काफी मुश्किल दौराहे पे है जिसमें ये बजट जो है ये प्रेजेंट किया गया है। एक तरफ इलेक्शन ईयर है, हुकूमत चाहेगी कि वो जो प्रो पीपल मेजर्स है वो ले। दूसरी तरफ एक IMF का फ्रेमवर्क है जिसके तहत हमें अपनी पॉलिसीज को अलाइन करना है, और अगर हम उस फ्रेमवर्क से डेविएट करते हैं तो हमें जो IMF की नेक्स्ट ट्रांच है वो नहीं मिल रही होगी, और अगर वो नहीं मिलती है तो फिर जो ना सिर्फ हमारे फॉरेन एक्सचेंज रिजर्व्स जो कि ऑलरेडी डिप्लीट हो रहे हैं वो खतरे में होंगे, बल्कि आपका जो दोस्त ममालिक से जो हमें सपोर्ट मिलनी है उनके डॉलर्स हमारे स्टेट बैंक में वो सबमिट करवाते हैं जो कि हमारे फॉरेन एक्सचेंज रिजर्व का हिस्सा बनते हैं सऊदी अरब और चाइना से या और ममालिक से, वो खतरे में पड़ जाएंगे। पाकिस्तान की क्रेडिट रेटिंग जो है वो ऑलरेडी इस वक्त नेगेटिव जा रही है। तो ये कुछ ऐसे फैक्टर्स हैं जिसमें कि हुकूमत को एक चॉइस करनी थी कि वो एक ऐसा बजट दे जिसमें लोगों पे उस बजट के जो आफ्टर इफेक्ट्स और जो मुश्किलात हैं वो भी कम हो, लेकिन IMF के साथ जो पाकिस्तान अपनी डील करने जा रहा है वो भी किसी खतरे का बायस ना बने, उसमें कोई रुकावट ना आए। अब जब हम इस बजट को देखते हैं जो कि पेश किया गया, उसमें हुकूमत ने रेवेन्यू बढ़ाने की कोशिश भी की है, उसमें अपने एक्सपेंडिचर्स कम करने की कोशिश भी की है, और ये सिर्फ इसी बजट में नहीं बल्कि हमेशा यही होता है हर बजट में कि हुकूमत जो होती है, स्पेशली जब आप IMF में होते हैं तो आपको ऑलरेडी पता होता है कि आपका माली खसारे का टारगेट जो है वो क्या है, उसके हिसाब से आप अपनी इनकम जो है वो थोड़ी सी बढ़ा के बजट में बयान कर देते हैं, जो अखराजात है वो थोड़े कम करके दिखा देते हैं और बात चल जाती है। लेकिन इस दफ़ा मामला थोड़ा सा मुख्तलिफ है। फार्मूला भी वही यूज़ हुआ है कि इनकम जो है वो बढ़ा दी गई है, एक्सपेंडिचर कम करके दिखाए गए हैं, लेकिन वो कुछ चीज़ें ऐसी होंगी जिस पर कि अभी भी IMF को एतराज़ होगा। मसलन अगर आपको याद हो तो IMF ने एक पूरा मिनी बजट पिछली हुकूमत से दिलवाया था जिसमें GST जो एग्जम्पशन थी वो ख़त्म करवाई थी। इस बजट में बहुत अच्छी बात है कि एग्रीकल्चर इक्विपमेंट्स पे, एग्रीकल्चर इनपुट पे, सोलर पैनल्स पे GST एग्जम्पशन बहाल कर दी गई है, लेकिन मुझे लग रहा है कि ये वापस लेनी पड़ेगी। इसी तरह से पर्सनल इनकम टैक्स पे IMF इनकम टैक्स रिफॉर्म्स की बात कर रही थी, वहाँ पे भी मुझे लगता है कि जो इस वक्त एक रिलीफ दिया गया है 1 मिलियन पर मंथ तक जिनकी सैलरी है उस ब्रैकेट को वो शायद पाकिस्तान को गवर्नमेंट को वापस लेना पड़ जाए। जब हम बात करते हैं फर्दर इनकम साइड की, उसमें 2-3 ऐसे हेड्स हैं जिसपे के काफ़ी ओवर एम्बिशियस टारगेट लग रहा है। पेट्रोलियम डेवलपमेंट लेवी की बात इसमें की गई है, 750 रुपये उससे कटे करने की, वो ओवर एम्बिशियस है। अगर वो सारा इकट्ठा करने की कोशिश की गई तो पेट्रोल की कीमतें आसमान पे पहुंच जाएंगी। इसी तरह से सूबों पे बात की गई कि वो प्रोविंशियल सरप्लस देंगे 800 रुपये का। अगेन हिस्टोरिकली हर हुकूमत रखती है प्रोविंशियल सरप्लस, लेकिन कभी भी वो मुकम्मल सरप्लस जो है वो नहीं मिलता। सरप्लस का मतलब है कि सूबे अखराजात नहीं करेंगे और फेडरल गवर्नमेंट को वापस कर रहे होंगे तो वो वापस नहीं आ रहा होगा। इसी तरह से 200 रुपये जो है वो GIDC के हैं, जो कि गैस इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर डेवलपमेंट सेस के हैं। ये लिटिगेशन में मामला लटका हुआ है बड़े अरसे से। पिछली हुकूमत ने इसको आउट ऑफ कोर्ट सेटल करने की कोशिश भी की, लेकिन अभी तक इसकी सेटलमेंट उस तरीके से नहीं आई। तो अगर हम इन्हीं 3 जो हेड्स हैं इसको देखें, जिसपे कि हुकूमत जो है वो कम से कम 1750 अरब रुपए जो है वो इनकम एक्सपेक्ट कर रही है। तो मेरा ज़ाती ख्याल ये है कि 1000 अरब रुपया जो है वो तो यहाँ से कम हो जाएगा। तो अगर आपका जो माली साल का खसारा है वो पहले दिन से आपको पता है कि अव्वल तो आपका बजट डेफिसिट में और उसके बाद इसमें मजीद कट लगेगी, तो इसका मतलब है कि ये पेनफुल प्रोसेस है। अगर हम बजट नंबर्स को देखते हैं तो सूबों को उनके शेयर देने के बाद वफाकी हुकूमत के पास जो टोटल बचते हैं वो है 4.9 ट्रिलियन रुपीस। अब इस 4.9 ट्रिलियन रुपीस में से अगर आप देखें तो जो हमारे पास एक्सपेंसेस आते हैं, जो डेट सर्विसिंग आपको सबसे पहले देना पड़ती है, तो उसका तकरीबन 41% जो है वो तो डेट सर्विसिंग में चला जाता है। उसके बाद फिर डिफेंस है, उसके बाद आपकी डे टू डे जो है गवर्नमेंट चलाने के अखराजात, और फिर आके डेवलपमेंट आती है। तो अगर थोड़ा सा इसको मैं बताऊं तो 4.9 ट्रिलियन रुपीस की इस वक्त इनकम है। ये सारी दिखा के जो हमने बात की, जिसमें से कि मैंने कहा कि शायद 1 ट्रिलियन मजीद कम हो जाए, लेकिन अगर ना भी कम हो तो 4.9 ट्रिलियन जो है वो 1 जुलाई को गवर्नमेंट एक्सपेक्ट कर रही है कि उसके पास इनकम होगी, जिसमें से 3950 बिलियन रुपए का जो है वो डेट सर्विसिंग हो जाएगी, सूद की अदायगी में चला जाएगा। 1523 अरब जो है वो डिफेंस में चले जाएंगे। 1180 अरब जो है वो सिविल गवर्नमेंट को चलाना है, पेंशन है, तनख्वाहें हैं, 550 रुपए की तनख्वाहें हैं, 530 अरब की पेंशन है, तो उसमें चला जाएगा। और उसके बाद सब्सिडीज और ग्रांट्स के लिए रखे गए हैं 20-40 अरब, और ये PSDP के अलावा है जो कि पब्लिक सेक्टर डेवलपमेंट प्रोग्राम होता है, जिसके लिए 808 अरब रुपए रखे गए। तो जो पहले 3 मैंने एक्सपेंस बताए, डेट सर्विसिंग है, डिफेंस है, डे टू डे रनिंग ऑफ गवर्नमेंट है, ये ऐसे एक्सपेंडिचर हैं जिसपे कोई भी हुकूमत जो है वो कमी नहीं कर सकती। तो ये एक किस्म के नॉन डिस्क्रिशनरी एक्सपेंडिचर होते हैं। पीपल्स पार्टी हो, PTI हो, PMLN हो, कोलिशन गवर्नमेंट हो, इवन नॉन इलेक्टेड गवर्नमेंट हो, तो ना वो डिफॉल्ट करने का खतरा मोल ले सकती है मुल्क को, उसको डेट सर्विसिंग करनी है, ना वो गवर्नमेंट की रनिंग जो है पेज एंड पेंशन उनको रोक सकती है, ना वो डिफेंस बजट को रोक सकती है। तो उसके बाद कट जो है वो आके डेवलपमेंट बजट पे लगता है। तो आज जो बजट इस वक्त पेश किया गया है, जिसमें कि मैंने कहा कि 4904 अरब की इनकम है फेडरल गवर्नमेंट की, और तकरीबन 4600 अरब रुपया गवर्नमेंट को कर्जा लेना पड़ेगा अगला पूरा साल चलाने के लिए। यानी ऑलमोस्ट 50% जो है, सॉरी ऑलमोस्ट 90% कर्जा लेना पड़ेगा जितनी उसकी इनकम है। और वो सूरत में अगर तमाम इनकम जो गवर्नमेंट ने परसीव की है वो मिल जाती है, अगर वहां से जो है वो आपको डेफिसिट आता है तो कर्जा मजीद बढ़ जाएगा, और जब मजीद कर्जा बढ़ेगा तो अगले साल के बजट में उस पर सूद की जो अदायगी है वो भी बढ़ जाएगी। आपको बाकी तमाम इशूज जो है वो उसी तरह से आ रहे होंगे। और ये बुनियादी तौर पे एक ऐसे साल में होने जा रहा है जबकि एक्सटर्नल फैक्टर्स भी पाकिस्तान के हक में नहीं है। अगर आप इंटरनली देखते हैं तो इंटरनली पॉलिटिकल इंस्टेबिलिटी गवर्नमेंट की जो है मुल्क की मईशत उसको अफेक्ट कर रही है। अगर आप एक्सटर्नली देखते हैं तो जो रशिया और यूक्रेन की वॉर, उसके नतीजे में आने वाली इन्फ्लेशन, और बल्कि अब उसको स्टैगफ्लेशन कहा जा रहा है, जो कि एक रिसेशन की एंटिसिपेशन जो है वो कर रहे हैं मल्टीलैटरल जो लेंडर्स हैं। तो अगर आपकी कोई रिसेशन आती है, या अगर एक इस वक्त एनर्जी पे कंप्लीट एम्बार्गो नहीं है रशिया पे, अगर वो हो जाता है तो फिर क्रूड ऑयल जो है, जो कि आज जिसकी कीमतें 122-23 डॉलर पर बैरल है, ये 150 डॉलर पर बैरल तक चली जाएंगी। और उसका जो ग्लोबल इन्फ्लेशन इम्पैक्ट है वो वर्ल्ड बैंक के ख्याल में तकरीबन 2% से ज्यादा 2.4% उसका ग्लोबल इन्फ्लेशन इम्पैक्ट आएगा। और अगर 2.4% ग्लोबल इन्फ्लेशन होती है तो फिर साजिद आपको बता रहे होंगे कि उसका पाकिस्तान पे डोमेस्टिक इफेक्ट जो है वो क्या आ रहा होगा। तो ये जो बजट में 11.5% हमने इन्फ्लेशन का टारगेट रखा है, ये भी अफेक्ट होगा। तो इट्स अ टफ ईयर पाकिस्तान के लिए, जिसमें कि हुकूमत को मुश्किल फैसले भी करने हैं, पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज को अपने इलेक्शन के लिए भी तैयारी करनी है, और पाकिस्तान के अवाम को इस सारे पॉलिटिकल सर्कस में रहते हुए जो एक्सटर्नल इन्वायरमेंट है उनके लिए भी तैयार रहना है। जो एक क्वेश्चन मिलता है इस सारे बजट में IMF की तरफ से, वो टारगेटेड सब्सिडीज का है कि आप टारगेटेड सब्सिडीज किस तरह की देना चाहते हैं और उसके लिए आप कहाँ से पैसे निकालते हैं, तो वो हमें देखना होगा। हमें फ्यूल प्राइसेस क्राइसिस को तो हम सब ऑब्जर्व कर रहे हैं। मेरी अपनी जो रीडिंग है वो ये है कि अगले 2-3 महीने में फूड क्राइसिस शुरू होने वाला है और वीट की कीमतें जो हैं वो काफ़ी एक्सीड कर जाएंगी और हुकूमत के लिए वो एक दर्दसर बनेगा जो फूड क्राइसिस है, क्योंकि ऑलरेडी जो फूड प्राइसेस हैं हमारे इस जब हम इन्फ्लेशन को कैलकुलेट करते हैं तो वो अनयूजुअली हाई हो रही है, तो उसके लिए भी हमें तैयारी करना है। अगर वन लाइन में कहूँ तो मेरा ख्याल है हुकूमत को एक रैशनैलिटी की तरफ जाना होगा और हमें एक राशनिंग की तरफ जाना होगा, खा वो एनर्जी है, खा वो हमारे रिसोर्सेज हैं, और सबसे बढ़ के जो अवाम को चैरिटी की तरफ जाना होगा कि जो लोग साहब इस्तात और साहब सरवत हैं वो ख्याल करें कि जो हमारे इनफॉर्मल सोशल सेफ्टी नेट्स हैं उनको हम किस तरह से सस्टेन करें। हुकूमत जाहिर है वो अपने फॉर्मल सेफ्टी नेट्स को तो स्ट्रेंथन कर रही होगी, लेकिन पाकिस्तान एक ऐसी कौम है यहाँ पे कि हमेशा से चैरिटी, सदका, खैरात ये इसका कॉन्सेप्ट रहा है और मेरा ख्याल है कि इस वक्त बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है उन तमाम लोगों के लिए जो कि इस्तात रखते हैं को अपने उन बहन भाइयों का सोचें जो कि इस्तात नहीं रखते। बहुत शुक्रिया।
थैंक यू सर, बहुत डिटेल से आपने और बहुत अच्छे से एक्सप्लेन किया। कुछ चीजें जो कि हमेशा से हमारे चैलेंज रही हैं, टैक्स कलेक्शन। जब भी बजट पेश होता है सबसे बड़ा एतराज अवाम का यही होता है कि इसमें टैक्सेस बहुत लगे हैं, क्योंकि डायरेक्टली कलेक्शन में हमेशा से हमें इश्यूज आते रहे हैं, तो इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेशन की तरफ हमेशा ही गवर्नमेंट जाती हैं। काफी एक चीज पे एहतजाज रिसेंटली देखने में आया कि ओवरसीज पाकिस्तानी पे भी टैक्स लग गया हुआ है। क्या उसका फिनोमेना है, कैसे वो इम्प्लीमेंट होगा? उस पर डॉक्टर वकार से हम रिक्वेस्ट करेंगे कि समझा सकें।
थैंक यू वेरी मच। A couple of slides on the subject. It's very similar, the same discussion. Dive into the taxation measures. I just wanted to talk about macroeconomic outlook. I think Dr. Suleri has already discussed that, and then I'll go straight into the taxation measures and their possible impact. Not probably, I thought that Dr. Suleri and Dr. Sajid would be covering impact on people and, of course, the poorest segment. I thought that we'll cover impact more on industry, maybe, given that the consolidation of growth that Finance Minister is talking about depends largely on our industrial output. So this is how, of course, the medium-term outlook, which is given in the budget document, this is how it is projected. We are standing at 6% economic growth, and the government is projecting that we will continue or consolidate around the same level. Many of the independent economists probably do not agree with this assessment, and they believe that due to factors outlined by Dr. Suleri, including the stagflation, in developed countries, including a slowdown in emerging markets, maybe 5% for fiscal year 23 is a long shot. That's what many are thinking. Likewise, due to factors outlined, including the food crisis, many are believing that the inflation target, which is kept at 11.5% for fiscal year 23, they believe that this is also an understatement, and it could range somewhere between 18 to 20% once the year ends. And this will have, of course, impact on revenues, government spending, etc. Just focusing more, as Aisha said, on tax revenue. I think this is what FBR is forecasted to collect as part of its tax effort. It comes to around 7 trillion rupees, which FBR is aiming to correct through direct tax measures or indirect tax measures. Of course, predominantly relying on the large growth that you're seeing in indirect taxes, but also, of course, some changes to trade taxes as well. But these revenues could come under strain, under stress, given that government is aiming to compress the imports. So overall demand compression could lead to lessening of FBR revenue. So again, a question mark, and will rely a lot on their fiscal effort. But these are not the only revenues which the government will be relying on during the fiscal year. There are also some non-tax revenue measures. I think Dr. Sab talked about GITC, but there is also petroleum levy on LPG, on oil, on crude, which the government has factored in. Currently, of course, it is in the range, collectively in the range of around 800 million, but one really needs to see whether IMF will be able to go by this number. Otherwise, non-tax revenues would require, including the petroleum levy, would require a greater effort, which could be regressive as well. Moving on, यहाँ से नहीं हो रहा. Thank you. So taxation measures, just to quickly go through measures on wage employed, measures on self-employed. The threshold level for both wage employed and self-employed has been increased. And there are some removal of tax exemptions, particularly on the savings, where, for example, people like us or private sector savings would find their way, including pension funds or mutual funds. There are removal of tax exemptions on them. For the smaller businesses, particularly the smaller retailers, there is a fixed tax regime which has been introduced and will be imposed as part of the electricity bill. And for non-filers, there is an incentivization to corporatize as well as to move towards documentation per se. But while, of course, it may bring relief to people really near to the threshold level, but if one looks at whether this kind of tax code which has been announced really goes that extra mile to tax the super salaries, for example, as we call them, it doesn't go that far. And if one looks at the average incidence on the salaried class, it's only after a very long salary curve, if you see, that the kink starts to go upwards. And of course, when it moves upwards, people believe that probably these were times which called for moving this kink ahead, and probably somewhere around 1 crore to 2 crores, between that amount. Currently, of course, you're seeing the average incidence climbing up, but people felt that it should have been scaled back in lieu of reduction in indirect taxes. But in terms of the overall structure of the average incidence, both the curves, the proposed text and the current text, almost overlap with each other. And the overlap is more certain when it comes to the self-employed tax code. The light green and the green line, which is the previous average instance and the one announced by this government, is almost the same. So in terms of whether there is some out-of-box thinking in rethinking the tax code or redoing the tax code to favor redistribution of incomes, one doesn't see that effort, of course. But one has to also keep in mind that the current structure of salaries or tax on AOP or business income or salary has yet to be sort of negotiated with the IMF. So the question comes to mind that if if both the curves or both the systems given by the previous government and the current government, in terms of average incidence, almost overlap each other, then what is it that the government was trying to do when it changes the tax code? So one of the reasons could be that probably government is aiming to reduce the compliance cost faced by taxpayers by reducing the slabs, tax slabs. And that, of course, is something which has long been demanded by many of the independent analysts, that reducing the number of slabs brings compliance costs faced by taxpayers downwards, but also reduces evasion in the tax system, avoidance in the tax system. So that's probably a good measure, and one really hopes that its implementation could see further reduction in the slabs going forward. And of course, a similar effort should also be done on the indirect taxation side. Currently on the indirect taxation side, if you look at the general sales tax, there are 40 different slabs at the moment, 40 different rates of GST. And it becomes very easy to evade or avoid the indirect taxes. Now, in terms of impact on industry, which will be, of course, the last section of my presentation, I've just tried to give select sectors that who benefited, who lost, for whom the impact was neutral, for example. Now, the textile, of course, given that it is an export-oriented sector, it receives reduction in customs duty on 10 tariff lines. Import on synthetic inputs has been rationalized. Immediate clearance of refunds has been ordered, and new gas rates to be notified. Now, while the above three elements are good in terms of reducing the burden on textile, but new gas rates which are in line with peer economies could see gas rates moving upwards. Similarly, the LNG subsidy that industry is getting currently is also been cut by 50%. But the overall impact on textile is expected to be neutral. In case of auto sector, the advanced tax on motor vehicle exceeding 1600 cc will now be in place. Advanced tax will also be collected in case of hybrid and electric cars. The rate of tax for non-filers shall be enhanced, and overall impact on auto sector is negative. So in terms of the brands or how much will each of them go upwards, our colleagues at Park Wheels have done their calculation, and they have released it yesterday in the evening. So you can see that brand-wise or category-wise, the various cars that will see increase depending upon whether you are a non-filer or a filer, and of course, this is the impact on locally assembled cars. Construction sector, the new tax regime on real estate will check speculation, hopefully. The rental income on second property having value more than the threshold will deemed to be 5% of fair market value. This hopefully should check a large part of speculative activity in real estate and construction. And over time, we're also seeing that there's an intent by the government to roll back a lot of the amnesty measures which were allowed to the construction sector. But then, while of course there's strictness on the taxation side, one sees that enhanced PSDP, if it materializes at 800 billion, could benefit allied industries, particularly cement, steel will be key beneficiaries. There are allocations for mega projects like Dasu and other dams, so hopefully the impact on construction sector should be neutral. Moving onward, we have the chemical sector, again a key input for our industry. We have seen rationalization of regulatory duties for most of their inputs, and one is expecting a positive impact in case of chemicals. In food processing, there is reduction in overall subsidies for food sector. However, at the production stage, there will be no sales tax on agricultural implements, machinery, seed. There is exemption of customs duty on import of some of the food processing inputs, and overall impact of this sector will be positive. fertilizer, sales tax has been enhanced to 10%. Sales tax on inputs has also been increased. GIDC collection, as we just heard, will be enhanced by 200 billion, although, of course, the NTN requirement, which was in place, will now favor the smaller buyers of fertilizer. But the overall impact of the taxation measures will be negative on fertilizer sector. IT, ICT, and communication technologies. There was a tax exemption which was allowed by the PTI government on export of IT. And of course, it had benefited the freelancers. But now that tax exemption has been withdrawn. And a new tax of 0.25% on exports is in place. Import of optic fiber cable will now be facing increased regulatory duty. This is primarily because the local sector feels that they can supply this and have requested for protection. Fund for improving IT exports, there is some allocation on the PSTP side, but overall, given the large number of freelancers associated and the large growth in IT activity that we have seen during COVID times, overall impact could be negative on the sector. Packaging, customs duty on many of the packaging inputs has been rationalized. There's also an exemption of customs duty on import of raw material that goes into paper sizing and bags. And overall impact is expected to be positive. And given that packaging is used as part of each and every other industry, it could contribute to lessening of cost of doing business for several industries. Other sectors, we see that in case of pharmaceuticals, customs duty has been exempted on 26 ingredients which are imported, and overall impact is positive. In case of oil and gas sector, the regulatory duty on import of oil spirits is now in place. And now that it'll be difficult to take benefit of those who are sourcing motor spirits under FTA, free trade agreement. And overall impact is still expected to be neutral, because before the regulatory duty, there used to be a customs duty, which has been removed. So while this will clear the way for wrong invoicing, the overall impact should be neutral. In case of renewable energy, alternate energy space, we have seen that sales tax exemption on import and supply of solar panels is there. And this is going to also benefit the smaller firms, smaller operators in farm sector, for example, where electricity load shedding could increase in the coming months, but they are being compensated in the form that solar panels could see reduction in their prices. Banking sector will face a windfall gain tax on banking companies of up to 42%. We felt, and we had also talked on other media forums as well, that this is where we believe that government could have attracted more taxation. Apart from the windfall tax, there would have been a separate tax regime for the open market operations in which banking sector participate, because it's the state bank which lends to the banks, the scheduled banks, who give it to the government on really risk-free profit. And that is something which could have been brought under a different tax regime. Last but not the least, there's been a very surprise exemption for the film industry. And one doesn't find that in the spirit of rationalizing tax expenditures across the board, one doesn't know why this industry sort of faced a different tax regime, including 5-year tax holiday to filmmakers, tax rebate to new cinemas, 10-year rebate to film and drama exports. But we don't find strong justification, given that there are several other industries which are facing much more acute grievances at this time. So in terms of total tax preferences or exemptions which have been allowed, while the government has tried to bring it down, but still in the system, there are around 1.7 trillion tax exemptions which have been given under the head of sales tax, income tax, customs duty. We believe that IMF will raise eyebrows on these large amounts which have been given under exemptions or preferences. Of course, under customs duty, it will be difficult to do away with some of them because many are part of your bilateral free trade agreements. But others would have been revisited, including those under China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, given that, of course, things are being renegotiated. In terms of conclusion, most taxation measures are targeting income and expenditure. But I think we had an opportunity to go after wealth, which we have missed. And that's why I said in the beginning that targeting income or expenditure only and not wealth means that you're not promoting the redistributive elements in the society. Tax and demand compression measures could dampen growth, which will have impact on your revenue. There is still room for redistributive measures in the corporate tax domain as well. Budget is trying to do both, which is austerity and fiscal expansion. This needs to be revisited. And in times of austerity, all sectors should share the same spirit. We believe that the spirit of tax expenditures, exemptions, preferences should have been, whatever the policy was, it should have been across all sectors. And there shouldn't have been any cherry picking when it comes to favoring certain sectors. So I'll just stop over here. Thank you.
So redistribution of wealth is what Dr. Abid also called for when he suggested that people shall increase charity. And if it had been done by the government, it would have been a good step as asserted by Dr. Vaqar as well. I mentioned a layman in the beginning. For the layman, what matters is inflation. So if Dr. Sajid would be kind enough to explain to this layman what would be the impact on inflation amid a food crisis that Dr. Abid signaled towards, which we are looking ahead to.
Thank you, Aisha. Presenting budget in layman language is as difficult as balancing the people and the IMF in this budget. It's really difficult task. And really, all the good things and the bad things about budget has already been said by Dr. Suleri and Dr. Vaqar. So I'll just try to sort of sneak some of the information which can plug in. Vaqar or Suleri. But let me give a context. The analysis generally is always in a context. Right? That is really important, that when we are reporting the numbers that I'll be sort of presenting you 3 numbers, they must be in context. The first context is that government is really very, very difficult. But just let you know, okay, we have prepared this very detailed analysis of budget on infographic. And we will also be making this a routine exercise for all the 5 budgets from moving forward. And we will try to issue this on the very day on the budget is presented going forward. Thanks to team that was working with me, Aksar, Aslan, Taimur, Imran, Umar. We have also done a very detailed gender analysis, thanks to Nudrat and Dr. Fariha, Aksar. Again, we have also done a sort of overall a deeper analysis of the budget that we aim to publish in next week or 2. But right now, I'll just focus on 2 to 3 things, and that is exactly on where is the public at large in this budget and where is the incidence of this budget for the common man, and particularly focusing on the major issue that Pakistan really faces, that is the inflation, जो महंगाई है इस वक्त, उसके साथ key focus. But just coming back to the context, government had very difficult choices. Though this does not bring any news. It's a common that Pakistan has a crisis always, and there's a budget always correcting the crisis. So really, I don't bring any news on this one. Government has to balance, but this time it was a very critical situation that we are having very unprecedented economic crisis. And you cannot compare it with the previous crisis that Pakistan has had actually. But at least for 3 reasons. I mean, there can be many, but only 3 reasons. For example, if you compare it with 2017 and 18 crisis that we had, a balance of payment crisis. That time, a new government was coming with a long-term agenda, with a fresh mandate, and it has its own vision and the time to implement its vision. The present government does not have that liberty. Number 2, we had a higher margin for policy tweaking. For example, हमारा उस वक्त जो inflation था, वो 4-5% के करीब था. जो interest rate है, वो 6 और 7% के करीब था. बट इस वक्त हम सारे डबल डिजिट में हैं, 14% के करीब और 12.75% के करीब हमारा इंटरेस्ट रेट है। तो वो जो मार्जिन है इंटरवीन करने का पॉलिसी फील्ड के अंदर वो बड़ा लिमिटेड है। मोस्ट इम्पॉर्टेंटली in 2017 we were going to IMF. Right now we are almost at virtually exiting IMF if it does not agree with this budget. So this program may be over. So these are three conditions which make this crisis a very special crisis, unprecedented, and this is where the government has to take these decisions. This graph is just only the information is not there. So आप इसको remove कर दें, otherwise थोड़ा सा Hamza, I just show it. So let me now come to 2 points. The one on the social protection, and then how the government's targets, particularly the inflation, GDP, and revenue targets. The government in no way can meet all those three targets simultaneously. One has to be sacrificed if other has to be achieved. I'll just show how. But let me begin with the social protection and relief to the common man. As Dr. Suleri also suggested, I mean, if you see, there is a big number on, if you add grants and PSDP and BISP, so it's roughly around 3 trillions. 2841 billion is on this, including grants and PSDP actually. So this is a big number, but the problems are much higher than this number, and I'll just show you. In social protection, if we go on the BISP allocations, these are 364 billion allocations. There are two numbers being reported, 360 and 364, based on the budget document and the speech actually. Even within the budget document, there are two. Last year it was 246 billion or 250 billion. Again, there are two numbers being reported. So this, I think on the face value, it sounds a good increase. But if speech of finance minister is any guide, I think this includes Prime Minister's 28 billion monthly Sasta Patrol package. But again, the most important is that if we break up this on Finance Minister's speech, there is very clearly written that the allocation for BISP cash transfer are 266 billion. It's 20 billion increase compared to the last year. And if Prime Minister's relief package is part of that 364, it means that PM's relief program is presently budgeted only for 3.5 months, not for the full year. This is exactly where it has a serious implications for the common man, that how long government will be providing this relief. If it is for 3.5 months, because if you multiply 28 with 3.5 and add 266 billion, you end up 364 billion. So inflation will be picking up over the last coming year, I mean the full coming year, but apparently it seems that the PM's relief package of 2,000 per month to people earning less than 40,000 is budgeted right now only for 3.5 months. अगर इसको हमें full साल के लिए budget करना होगा, तो we need 336 billion rupees actually, other than this. So apparently it sounds that it is not built, it's only for 3.5 billion. Given we would totally understand that there is a serious fiscal constraints that the government does have, and particularly presently from the relief package, the people, households who are earning more than 40,007 and less than 70,000, they are not covered anywhere, and there can be some sort of steps that provincial governments may cover above and beyond these 40,000 which federal government is covering from its own budgets. The provincial governments can focus on this class, that is 40 to 70,000, because the inflation is really stressing this class as well, because they are not finding any relief on this one. Particularly if the IMF has some concerns on the salary slab adjustments and they get back to again 0.60 million, they will lose the relaxation for non-taxable salary that has been announced in this budget. It will be taken back and the inflation and pressure may go up. On a summary, as a result of these measures that government is taking, the opportunities for livelihoods and employment will be reduced, will decrease in coming year, and the purchasing power of the people, the buying capacity will erode further. Because as Dr. Vaqar Sahab also suggested, that inflation will be really picking up, because you cannot expect an inflation of 11.5% compared to previous year's 11.7% when you are raising petrol prices per liter at least ₹100 if you have to take IMF program back on track. We'll give you some calculations on here. The average annual inflation for 23 that we are estimating, but these are preliminary estimated and must be quoted by showing that these are very preliminary estimates, will hover around 15% plus minus 1. So it can be 14% to 16% average inflation in financial 23 compared to target of 11.5%. There are many reasons, but let's just me give one reason. The government has set a target of PDL of 750 billion, Petroleum Development Levy of 750 billions. There is roughly 1 billion liters consumption, 1.5 billion liter consumption monthly in Pakistan. So if government levies ₹30 PDL imposes, it will be able to collect 540 billion rupees per annum. Throughout the year, it can only collect 540 billion, which is still 210 billion less than the target. But let's assume that it stops at 540 billion and it increases the levies of 30 rupees per liter. The government is already giving a subsidy of 11 rupees at current prices. So if IMF has to be back on track and the conditions apply, so government will be increasing rupees 41 per liter in next month from July onward, if it has to meet the target of 540 billion rupees from PDL. We have run some estimations that ₹100 per liter increases the inflation by 4.5 percentage point. So if you 11.7 जो current average inflation है उसमें अगर आप 4.5 inflation करते हैं add, so this is a 15.2% inflation which is there. And still we haven't added the electricity price hike, the kerosene, the diesel, and any further global oil price hike. ये जो estimate है ये current prices हैं जो global की उसके ऊपर है कि अगर government सिर्फ पेट्रोल पे अपनी subsidies को zero करती है, as per IMF condition, the inflation will increase around 5 percentage point. So you can see. But what will happen at the same time, there are some estimates, as Vaqar Sahab also suggested, the experts are believing that it can touch upon 20%. But I think SDPI is bringing another perspective into it. Over the last couple of years, State Bank has been having a net positive real interest rate. So if the inflation goes to 15% on average, let's assume, State Bank will be forced to increase the interest rate, policy rate at least to 16%, from 12.75% to 16%. The average that we are sort of expecting by end of the year is the increase of 325 base points to 525 base points. 350 से लेके 550 base points. इसका मतलब है कि 3.25% से लेके 5.25% तक का inflation जो है, sorry, interest rate जो है वो बढ़ेगा. This will slightly control inflation. क्योंकि जब आपका interest rate बढ़ता है, जो पाकिस्तान की एविडेंस है वो सजेस्ट करती है कि चूंकि लिंक बहुत ज्यादा स्ट्रॉन्ग नहीं है, तो वो शायद कोई 1 से 1.5% इन्फ्लेशन को कंट्रोल कर ले. So overall, with the scenario that global oil prices remain same, interest rate goes to 3.25 से लेके 5.25% up. So this will control inflation around 14.5 से लेके 15% तक. That is the range that we are giving for the average year financial 23. तो आप इससे अंदाजा लगा लें कि अगर इतना इन्फ्लेशन बढ़ता है और सब्सिडी अगर सिर्फ 3.5 महीने की है जो रिलीफ पैकेज है, so this is a very difficult situation for the common man. But then there is more to come. बिकॉज जब स्टेट बैंक अपना इंटरेस्ट रेट बढ़ाएगा तो आपका जो इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ रेट है वो स्लो डाउन हो जाएगा। हमारी जो एस्टिमेट्स हैं जो बड़ी प्रिलिमिनरी हैं अभी, वो ये बताती हैं कि जब स्टेट बैंक 100 बेस पॉइंट इंटरेस्ट रेट को बढ़ाता है तो आपका जो ग्रोथ रेट है जीडीपी का वो 0.45% कम हो जाता है। सो एज्यूम कर लें कि अगर 200% बढ़ता है तो आपका जो ग्रोथ रेट है वो 1% कम हो जाएगा, मतलब 5% से 4% पे वो आ जाएगा बेसिकली। और ऐसी सूरत में अगर हम 325 बेस पॉइंट का बढ़ाते हैं तो 1.5% के करीब आपका ग्रोथ रेट जो है वो कम हो जाएगा। So what we think at a preliminary estimates, the government may end up somewhere 3 to 4% of GDP growth rate, जो कि उसमें आएगा उसमें। और ये इसकी जो implications है आम आदमी के लिए, वो रोजगार के मौके हैं और आमदन के मौके हैं, वो इस साल की निस्बत कम हो जाएंगे, 2022 की निस्बत मजीद कम होंगे। तो 3 तरह से जो बर्डन है आम आदमी के ऊपर आ रहा है उसको, मेनली 2, आपका इन्फ्लेशन जो है वो बढ़ रहा है और सेम टाइम आपकी जो इनकम है वो कम हो रही है, आपके जो आमदन के मौके हैं वो कम हो रहे हैं। सो डिफिकल्ट सिचुएशन फॉर कॉमन मैन। बट थर्डली, जस्ट टू क्लोज, कि अगर ये दोनों चीजें होती हैं, इन्फ्लेशन और जीडीपी ग्रोथ रेट स्लो डाउन होता है, तो आपका जो रेवेन्यू टारगेट है जो गवर्नमेंट ने रखा हुआ है वो डिस्टर्ब हो जाएगा। क्योंकि करंटली हमें लग रहा है, while we don't have any evidence, बट लग ये रहा है कि गवर्नमेंट ने जो कैलकुलेट किया है 7004 बिलियन का टारगेट, वो 15% इन्फ्लेशन के बगैर पूरा नहीं हो सकता, क्योंकि ये 16% ग्रोथ है लास्ट ईयर के रेवेन्यू से, जब आप 6000 बिलियन से 7004 बिलियन पे गए हैं। तो उसके लिए अगर 15% इन्फ्लेशन होगा और 3.5 से 4% आपका अगर ये आता है जीडीपी ग्रोथ रेट, फिर आप वो रेवेन्यू टारगेट मीट कर पाएंगे। और वो भी उस सूरत में अगर आपका पीडीएल 750 बिलियन पे जाता है तो आप समझ लें कि अगेन फर्दर पेट्रोल प्राइस हाइक्स उसके अंदर होंगे, तो आपका जीडीपी ग्रोथ रेट फर्दर डिक्लाइन जो है वो करेगा। तो ये सिचुएशन है बेसिकली। तो वी विल बी गिविंग जस्ट यू 2 टारगेट्स जो हम इस पे भी मजीद काम कर रहे हैं कि इन्फ्लेशन विल रिमेन 14.5 से 15.5% अगले साल में ऑन एवरेज, और जो जीडीपी ग्रोथ रेट है वो 3 से 4% के दरमियान रहेगा। और जो टारगेट है रेवेन्यू का वो बड़ा मुश्किल होगा मीट करना उसके अंदर। बट जस्ट टू गिव कि ये सारी की सारी जो एस्टिमेट्स हैं, दीज आर बेस्ड ऑन द assumption कि आईएमएफ अपना प्रोग्राम रिज्यूम करेगा। अगर आईएमएफ अपना प्रोग्राम रिज्यूम नहीं करता है तो जो सिचुएशन है वो शायद इससे भी ज्यादा खराब जो है वो बेसिकली हो सकती है। द प्रायोरिटी फोकस आई थिंक गवर्नमेंट का जो इस बजट में था वो आईएमएफ ही को ऑन बोर्ड लेना था। फाइनली सम सजेशंस कि गवर्नमेंट को क्या करने की जरूरत होगी। आई थिंक जो सबसे बड़ा कंसर्न रहेगा अगले महीने इस साल में वो महंगाई होगा, और गवर्नमेंट को 2 से 3 एंगल से इस पे काम करने की जरूरत है। बेसिकली आप आम आदमी को रिलीफ 3 तरह से पहुंचा सकते हैं। एक तो उसकी इनकम को बढ़ाएं, जो नहीं हो रहा होगा इस साल में हमारे प्रिलिमिनरी एस्टिमेट्स के मुताबिक, और गिवन कि हम कंसोलिडेट कर रहे हैं, इकोनॉमी को टाइट पॉलिसी पे जा रहे हैं। दूसरा ये है कि आप इन्फ्लेशन को कंट्रोल करें, जो अगेन थोड़ा सा मुश्किल लगता है गिवन के जो हमारा इकोनॉमिक लेआउट है, जो एक्सपेंडिचर और रेवेन्यू लेआउट है, और एक्सटर्नल फैक्टर्स, पर्टिकुलरली अगर यूक्रेन और रशिया की वार कंटिन्यू करती है तो आपका जो फूड इन्फ्लेशन से जो प्रेशर आएगा, तो आपका जो फूड इन्फ्लेशन है दैट कैन गो, वी हैवंट स्टिल एस्टिमेटेड बट प्रिलिमिनरी आइडियाज जो एक्सपर्ट से आ रहे हैं वो 22 से 23% की रेंज में जा सकता है, करंटली 17.25 से। सो इट कैन बी हायर नंबर ऑन फूड इन्फ्लेशन। एंड मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंटली कि जो आम आदमी है उसकी इनकम का 70%, 60 से 70% जो गरीब आदमी है वो फूड आइटम्स पे जाता है। तो अगर वो 20% से ऊपर चला जाता है तो वेरी डिफिकल्ट सिचुएशन। तो गवर्नमेंट को इन्फ्लेशन पे काम करने की जरूरत होगी। नंबर 1 विद स्टेट बैंक ऑफ पाकिस्तान कि उसके साथ उसको करे। स्टेट बैंक को हर चीज इंटरेस्ट रेट पे नहीं डालनी चाहिए, थोड़ा सा उसकी जो एक्टिव कम्युनिकेशन स्ट्रेटजी है उसके जरिए इन्फ्लेशन एक्सपेक्टेशंस को मैनेज करना चाहिए। तीसरे नंबर पे एक चीज जो मुझे लगता है अभी बहुत मिसिंग है और जिससे एक पैनिक आ रहा है कि ये 11.5% का टारगेट आया कहां से है। हाउ हैज गवर्नमेंट sort of estimated this target? तो अगर गवर्नमेंट ये कम्युनिकेट करती है मार्केट को कि हमने इस तरह से इसको किया है, तो वो जो एक पैनिक है इन्फ्लेशन के ऊपर वो मुझे लगता है किसी हद तक कम हो सकता है। अदरवाइज इन्फ्लेशन का एक प्रॉब्लम ये होता है कि इन्फ्लेशन वही होता है जो आप एक्सपेक्ट करते हैं। तो अगर मार्केट में ये एस्टेब्लिश हो जाता है कि 15-20% इन्फ्लेशन होगा तो हम अगले साल इसी पे एंड कर रहे होंगे। तो गवर्नमेंट शुड रिलीज sort of convey to the public at large कि ये जो 11.5% का नंबर आया है ये कैसे आया है, उससे मुझे लगता है थोड़ा सा मार्केट में प्रेशर कम होगा। फूड इन्फ्लेशन के लिए हम बार बार पिछले 1 साल से कह रहे हैं कि जो प्राइस कंट्रोल कमेटीज हैं, जो असिस्टेंट कमिश्नर ऑफिसेज हैं, जो डीसी ऑफिसेज हैं, उनको बड़ा एक्टिवली एंगेज करना चाहिए फूड इन्फ्लेशन को मैनेज करने के लिए, कंट्रोल करने के लिए, पर्टिकुलरली वो जो पेरिशेबल फूड आइटम्स का आ रहा है ड्यू टू होर्डिंग, ड्यू टू प्रॉफिटेरिंग, ड्यू टू स्मगलिंग, और उसको अगर गवर्नमेंट करती है तो किसी हद तक जो है वो रिलीफ जो है वो गवर्नमेंट ले सकती है। I think this was all bad news from my side. Thank you.
There were quite a lot of bad news. There are certain things which are under a man's control. And I would say man because though we would want to include more women in the cycle, but it's a reality that men are actually running the show in Pakistan. So there is one burden that no man is able to sustain. If you suggest that the inflation is going to rise and the income is going to reduce, maybe we can cut on many things, but health budget is one thing that no family can cut off on. From 2015, we have had this different type of Sehat Sahulat programs. And they've continued throughout this time with an objective of reducing out-of-pocket expenditure. How is this budget going to reflect on those programs? Dr. Razia will brief us on that.
Thank you very much, Aisha, for this question. And lot of economics and lot of analysis, but I will go through as a public health expert, I will go through the simpler side of the budget, and which is the health budget, and it's related to the health service delivery to the common man. So we all know that the health is a devolved subject, and it's basically the health service delivery is with the provinces, but with the federal government, it's only the Islamabad and some attached departments, and the Gilgit-Baltistan and the AJK is also now they're having the separate budgets for that. So this time, I think the first thing is that there is a slashing of the budget, health budget with the federal government. That is the Ministry of National Health Services. It's only the 19 billion rupees is allocated to the budget for the federal government. And the provincial, obviously the grants and the allocations are different, but this is just for the federal government. And it's like, and the previous year it was 28 billion, but due to the COVID-19, there was a lot of, almost 154 billion rupees was spent on the health. And out of that, the public health expenditure was 126 billion, which was due to the COVID, for the COVID management, vaccines and hospital and all. And this was all over the country. This was, the portion was given to the other provinces also. And for the health budget, it is usually for the Sehat Sahulat program is this time. The previous year it was 4.87 or 5 at one of the documents has shown the 5 billion rupees, but this time it is only 2 billion rupees, and which is almost half. And it's because of that, because the sum of the social health insurance or the Sehat Sahulat program is gone to the provinces now, and but still it is very low. And the objective of the Sehat Sahulat program was to reduce the out-of-pocket spending of the common people, so that whenever there is a health catastrophe or health emergency, so that they are not affected by that. And but at the moment, I think by reducing this budget, this shows that it's not happening. And so far it's almost 7 years now in the Sehat Sahulat program, and there is no assessment of the Sehat Sahulat program which reflects that it is the out-of-pocket expenditure has reduced by the government. Rather, it's there are some small papers which are showing that it might have, because all the hospitals are empaneled are the private hospitals, and the amount which is spent on one person is very low, and for according to one estimate, if for the public in the public sector only $15 are spent on one person per capita spending, and for as a benchmark it's $86 which needs to be spent on to have a universal health coverage, or the coverage which is like the available, accessible, and without the economic shock. So I think we are far ahead. We are way behind that with the source, and with this budget, I think there is it's a lot of negative. It will have negative impact, and it should have been better.
Thank you, Dr. Razia. I have this one question, which I believe will be very close to the hearts of all the SDPI people over here. It's about the increase in salaries of the private sector. So I think Dr. Vaqar might be able to reply to this. Question ये कि जहाँ एक तरफ आप फूड क्राइसिस की बात कर रहे हैं, वहीं ये बात अपनी जगह है कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर के मुलाजमीन की तनख्वाहें नहीं बढ़ाई गई हैं। हर बजट में सरकारी मुलाजमीन की तनख्वाहें बढ़ जाती हैं, हालांकि सरकारी मुलाजमीन की तादाद चंद लाख है। प्राइवेट सेक्टर को हुकूमत कोई रिलीफ क्यों नहीं देती?
नहीं, बिल्कुल आपने सही कहा, प्राइवेट सेक्टर को हुकूमत रिलीफ नहीं देती। जवाब जो है वो उसी में सवाल में ही है। But this is also true that we would like that I can't say for the entire private sector, but at least for the non-profit organizations, including ours, for example, one would like that the taxation burden should come down. The compliance of this taxation and the cost incurred for that compliance, that should come down. Currently, of course, it's one of the highest globally, if compared globally. So I believe that the room to provide, of course, remuneration, or of course reward, or of course any accruing of savings to the organization is a function of whether the organization is able to save something or not. And I think the question is, the spirit of the question is correct, that we should, any budget should enable private or even non-profit organizations to augment their savings, that's where the focus should be, because any savings that they're able to make, they'll be able to spend on the welfare of their employees, but also reinvest into the next year operations.
Thank you so much. The floor is open for questions. So if any one of you have any questions. Yes, sir.
डिस्कशन हो रही है, जो इस दफा FBI की कलेक्शन है वो तकरीबन 5818 होगी, यानी कि जो हम 6.1 ट्रिलियन कह रहे थे वो नहीं है, उसमें तकरीबन 182 बिलियन का जो टैक्सेस के अंदर वो आ रहा है वो हमें इम्पैक्ट करेगा उसके बाद जो आप ये कह रहे थे। और दूसरी बात कि जो हम ये बात कर रहे हैं कि पेट्रोल लेवी जो है 30 रुपीज़ हो, तो जो तैयारियां जो हमारी बातचीत हो रही है वो ये कि इस लेवी को जो है 50 रुपीज़ तक लेके जाया जाएगा और जो GST है उसको मिनिमाइज किया जाएगा या शायद ख़त्म ही कर दिया जाए। इसका जो है बहुत नेगेटिव इम्पैक्ट आएगा NFC के ऊपर, क्योंकि लेवी जो है वो फेडरल की है और NFC जो है वो सूबों का। जैसी GST आप ख़त्म करेंगे तो जो NFC के अवार्ड के तहत रकम मिलनी होती है वो कम हो जाएगी और सूबों के लिए अपना एक्सपेंडिचर मेंटेन करना बड़ा मुश्किल होगा। एक ये पॉइंट था। दूसरा ये कि हम जो आज आप अखबार में खबरें देख रहे हैं कि जी IMF के लिए बड़ा मुश्किल होगा हमसे बातचीत करना और हमें जो है वो बड़ी चैलेंजिंग सूरत हाल होगी, तो उसके ऊपर जो हमारी बातचीत हुई थी वो यही है कि जो बिजली के बिलों के ऊपर जो प्रेजेंटेशन जो हमने लिखी थी उसके अंदर बड़ा इम्पैक्ट, बड़ा मास किस्म का इम्पैक्ट है रेवेन्यू मेजर्स के अंदर। इसी तरह जो है वो जो बिजली के बिलों से अमाउंट होगी, जो कॉर्पोरेट सेक्टर के ऊपर उन्होंने 2% टैक्स लगाया है, जिनकी जो है वो 300 मिलियन से ज़्यादा की इनकम है, चाहे वो कोई इंडिविजुअल है या कंपनी है, उसके ऊपर जो टैक्स लगाया है उसका भी पॉजिटिव इम्पैक्ट आएगा। और जो अभी आपने बात की 28 बिलियन के रिलीफ की पेट्रोलियम के ऊपर, उस पर जो हमारी बातचीत हुई थी तो हमने ये सवाल किया था, जो अभी ये आया कि जी प्राइवेट सेक्टर को क्या रिलीफ मिले, तो ये दलील आई कि जी वो जो हम 20 रुपए पेट्रोल पे सब्सिडी दे रहे हैं उन लोगों को जिनकी इनकम जो है 40,000 से कम है, तो जिनकी इनकम 1 लाख रुपए से कम है उनको जब आप 2.5% जो है वो इनकम टैक्स में रिलीफ दे देते तो वो तकरीबन जो है वो 25 रुपए का जो है ना उनको, यानी कि 2500 रुपए पर मंथ उन लोगों को रिलीफ मिल जाएगी। तो ये दो तीन पॉइंट जो मैं आपको कहना चाह रहा था। तो ये टैक्सेस हमारे कम होंगे और एनएफसी के तहत जो है वो जीएसटी कम होगा, कलेक्ट नहीं होगा, और पीडीएल होगा। और ये कि जो ओवरऑल हमारा इनकम टैक्स का जो इम्पैक्ट है वो तकरीबन 264 बिलियन के आसपास पॉजिटिव है। तो किसी हद तक शायद आईएमएफ को हम पुरानी एग्जामिशंस में तो नहीं लेकिन नई एग्जामिशन में जरूर जो है वो मना सकें।
साजिद साहब से ये आपने जो कैलकुलेट किया है इसमें तो मॉनेटरी टाइटनिंग भी फिर करनी पड़ेगी, मतलब अदर देन बेसिस पॉइंट पर वैसे इसका रेवेन्यू के ऊपर इम्पैक्ट होगा, मीनिंग बाय जो टी बिल्स जो है वो अपनी मुद्दत पूरी करेंगे उनको रिलीज करने के लिए ले किया जाएगा, जो इन्वेस्टमेंट पैटर्न है वो भी चेंज होगा। तो ये तो बजट की पूरी बेसिस चेंज आपने कर, वो बजट हम फिगर्स देख रहे हैं वो तो रियल ना होगा। एक तो इस पे दूसरा कुछ ये छोटा सा मैं डॉक्टर वकार साहब से ये आंसर इसका मुझे पता है, ये फिल्म का आपने कहा है उससे बड़ा फायदा होगा, मांडवी वाला पिक्चर जो है वो बहुत सी अच्छी देखने को
थैंक यू जी। एक तो मुझे लगता है कि जो मैं हमारा है कि एम्बिशियस है, शायद रियलिस्टिक या रियल कहना चले, वर्ल्ड का जो नाव है बस। हमने ऑलरेडी पाकिस्तान में मॉनेटरी टाइटिंग पिछले 1 साल से हो रही एग्जैक्टली और यही हमने कहा, और हम उसको एज ए मेजर टूल, क्योंकि जब हम थोड़ा सा एस्टिमेट रन कर रहे थे तो हमारे पास जो सबसे बड़ा अहम टूल होता है वो पॉलिसी रेट होता है। सो वी सॉर्ट ऑफ सिमुलेटेड इट थ्रू पॉलिसी रेट। लेकिन जाहिर है जब वो अनफॉर्चुनेटली पाकिस्तान में ये हो रहा है कि जो मार्केट है वो स्टेट बैंक से आगे जा रही है। मार्केट जब स्टेट बैंक जब भी इंटरेस्ट रेट बढ़ाता है, मार्केट 1-1.5 परसेंटेज पॉइंट जो टी बिल्स का जो कर्व है, यील्ड कर्व है, वो बढ़ा देता है उसके ऊपर। तो स्टेट बैंक हैज बीन चेजिंग दोस यील्ड्स, वो रहेगा शायद आने वाले टाइम में भी। बट जब आपकी जो ग्रोथ है वो डैम्पन होगी, स्लो डाउन होगी, 3-3.5% पे आते हैं तो वो शायद 4% पे। तो एक तो ये। दूसरा, मैं बिल्कुल एग्री करता हूँ निजामी साहब से। मैंने जो 30 रुपए का रखा था वो मैंने जस्ट एक मिनिमम रखा था कि अगर मिनिमम भी वो ये करते हैं तो इन्फ्लेशन इतना चला जाएगा। और अगर वो 750 बिलियन ही लेना चाहती है गवर्नमेंट, इससे तो जाहिर है फिर 50 पे जाना पड़ेगा और वही फिर आपका इन्फ्लेशन और ग्रोथ रेट पे ट्रांसलेट होगा। तो मैंने कहा था कि अगर मिनिमम रखते हैं और 11 रुपए की करंट सब्सिडी खत्म करते हैं तो वो 39 रुपए जो है वो बन जाता है। बाकी जाहिर है इस पे डिस्कशन जरूर हो रही है, बातचीत चल, मैंने भी सुना है कहीं कि हाँ बिल्कुल। तो इसलिए मैंने उसको मैक्सिमम लिमिट पे जो 30 है उस पे रखा था कि उससे ऊपर गवर्नमेंट अभी जाएगी नहीं। तो देखते हैं वो क्या होता है, बट वो जस्ट एक सिनेरियो बिल्डिंग के लिए था कि एक्चुअली इन्फ्लेशन कितना हो सकता है। थैंक यू।
एक और क्वेश्चन ऑनलाइन आया है, आई थिंक Dr. Abid can respond to it. What efforts are we seeing in this budget to secure our foreign reserves? And also funding for climate ministry was slashed as well. How would this affect our SDG progress?
कि सारा का सारा बजट जो है वो बुनियादी तौर पे फॉरेन रिजर्व जो है उन्हीं को सिक्योर करने के लिए बनाया जा रहा है। जितनी भी एफर्ट्स हैं, जैसा कि आपको इब्तदाइये में कहा गया था कि ये बजट जो है ये हुकूमत एक टाइट रोप पे है। एक तरफ उसको इलेक्शन ईयर्स में अपने जो वोटर्स हैं, कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट्स हैं, उनको खुश रखना है, दूसरी तरफ IMF को साथ अपने मामला जो है वो सीधे रखने। तो वो तो जाहिर है, और इसमें जो प्रेसिडेंस लेगा, जो प्रायोरिटी होगी वो यही है कि IMF जो है वो इसको एक्सेप्ट करता है या नहीं करता, और अगर नहीं करता तो जाहिर है कि आपके फॉरेन एक्सचेंज रिजर्व जो है वो खतरे में पड़ जाएंगे। और अगर IMF के साथ आपको मिल जाती है डील, तो ना सिर्फ ये कि फॉरेन एक्सचेंज रिजर्व बल्कि रुपए की कद्र जो है, जैसा कि आपने देखा आज बजट के पहले दिन स्टॉक एक्सचेंज मार्केट में भी एक ब्लड शेड हुआ, ब्लड बाथ हुआ, और रुपए की कद्र में भी कमी हुई। तो ये चीज़ें जो है ये इम्प्रूव करेंगी। क्लाइमेट चेंज पे थोड़ा सा इसको देखना होगा। कुछ रकम है जो कि क्लाइमेट चेंज के लिए रखी गई है करंट अकाउंट एक्सपेंडिचर में, जो मिनिस्ट्री के ऑपरेशनल एक्सपेंडिचर्स के लिए होती है। कुछ है जो कि SDGs के लिए जो एलोकेशन है उसमें होगी। बदकिस्मती से पिछले अगर आप 10 सालों का एक्सपीरियंस देखें तो SDG की जो एलोकेशन जो होती है वो सियासी मकासद के लिए इस्तेमाल होती रही है। तो वो हम अपने पार्लियामेंटेरियंस को देते हैं उनके तरक्याती प्रोग्रामों के लिए। तो अगर तो वो इस दफ़ा भी उसी सूरत में जाएगी तरक्याती प्रोग्रामों की नज़र, तो फिर शायद क्लाइमेट चेंज को उस तरह से उसका फायदा नहीं पहुंचेगा। लेकिन अगर वो गोल वाइज SDGs के लिए इस्तेमाल हो रही होगी तो शायद थोड़ा सा क्लाइमेट चेंज को वहां से आप कर सकते हैं। टेक केयर।
Is one last question from our online audience, or yeah, one maybe.
So I basically have two questions. The first one is directed to Dr. Vaqar Ahmed in particular, and then the second question would perhaps be answered by the panel. So first question would be about broadening the tax base. While of course freelancers have been included into the tax net to this new budget, however, services like PayPal or even Web3 are not available in Pakistan. So freelancers receive their payments from roundabout methods, which usually are not documented. So even if we do include them into the tax base, however, perhaps their income and their salaries that are coming in will not be included, and perhaps will not be taxed in that matter. So, and secondly, sir, we do have a major chunk of the economy that's informal. For example, Karyana stores, or you have general stores, etc. Or perhaps even a woman who's sitting at her home and has an Instagram shop set up. So these people are also currently not part of the tax base. So my question would be mainly about, can we expect the government to make sure that our budget can be dynamic in nature, in the sense that if we do find solutions to these, and while these unregistered businesses do become part of the economy, will they be included in the tax base within this fiscal year, or is this something that we can expect later on in the next year? And the second question, G, will be about the education part of the budget, which we can see is just an additional figure of 6 billion. So my question would be particularly about research and development. If we look towards growing powers and superpowers all around the world, USA has immense emphasis on research and development, so does China, etc. So in Pakistan, if we've slashed the education budget to such an extent, and then we see that, of course, fulfilling basic education needs would be very difficult in a let alone research and development. So how does it bode for research and development institutes like SDPI itself? Of course, there will be development partners, but when it comes to working with the government, how is this going to affect us?
Quickly club the online question with it. Are there any measures in this budget to support exports? Whoever of you would want to address this.
Thank you, Mahanur. I think just a couple of things. People in the finance ministry this year around, they actually thought that the taxes on IT and ICT sectors should have been much higher. They, of course, kept their ambition at bay, they kept it low, but I think there were voices that this sector has gained a lot during the pandemic times, and the expansion is about the freelancers. The freelancing sector is doing well, and given that a large part of freelancing sector earns in dollar terms. So the intent of the Ministry of Finance was to really go further, but I think Ministry of IT presented their own budget proposals as well, and of course Pasha and other organizations also presented their budget proposals, due to which, of course, there was a settlement that still the industry may be in infancy. We want the freelancers to corporatize over time. So let's start with something more minimum. I think your question has this sub part, which is that you don't only want tax facilitation for this sector, but also, of course, that their funding constraints should also ease. You talked about PayPal. So I think in that segment, their biggest request, IT sector's biggest request was to allow crowdfunding, which Pakistan wasn't able to allow due to FATF. But this time around, I'm happy to note that SECP has allowed the sandbox, and on experimentation basis, they have allowed 3 or 4 companies to move forward with crowdsourcing from external players, from even outside of Pakistan. And one hopes that if this sandbox is, or the experience is successful, this will be open to other companies as well. On the informal sector, I think the government was mindful. They didn't go towards measures that we had, for example, seen during the 2019-20 budget, in which there was a very hard measures to bring informal sector to the formal sector. I think the government was mindful about the inflationary pressures that this sector has. But therein again, I think I had made a point that they are still trying to incentivize the informal sector to come to the formal sector. But of course, it can be debated whether the way is correct or not. So they have started taxing their expenditure rather than the income of the informal sector, which is, of course, the implied meaning that you see when it comes to the tax regime for small retailers, that their income tax will appear in the electricity bill. Right.
Okay. Education, climate change, health, environment. So most of these things, when we have to look at their allocations, we need to also look at their respective allocation in the provincial budgets. So when we look at the federal budget, as Dr. Razia rightly pointed out, in case of federal budget health allocation, that would only be allocation for ICT and for GB, and the same goes true for education. But if one looks at the holistic allocation of the provinces in it as well, then perhaps one can look at the numbers. But I agree with your observation. Education, and especially higher education, skilled education, that has chronically been remained as a neglected component of our budget allocations.
So if you want to talk about the export.
I think for the exporting industry, I think the budget is to a large extent favorable. When you look at the measures for taxation for textile sector, particularly the manner in which customs duties on their inputs has been rationalized, chemical, pharmaceutical. So in several industries, the imports, the liberalization of imports is intended with the expectation that their exports will increase. Pharma exports are just starting to pick up, and that's why their ingredients, 26 ingredients, customs duty has been rationalized over there. So I believe that for exporting industry, there is a realization that they should continue to integrate in global value chains, and of course we want that forex to continue. We want to consolidate the gains which, of course, exporting sectors have made based on the weakening of rupee, and that's why I think the curbs on imports that we see on many other commodities, we don't see that on the imported inputs of exporting industries.
Thank you, sir. There were a lot of bad news and some good news as well. And while we are expecting inflation to rise further and we are expected to cut down on unnecessary expenditure, we still have some cake out there we can enjoy. So let's head towards the tea. Thank you all for joining us today.